are talking Cosmic Sin. This one directed and co-written by Edward Drake and stars Bruce Willis, Frank Grillo, Lachlan Monroe and Costas Mandylor, among others. And this is a kind of a science fiction alien war movie. Now, I want to cast your minds back to a classic science fiction movie, The Day the Earth Stood Still. Now, there was a scene in that where our visitors land on Earth and they are greeted by rows upon rows of military, and one soldier panics and shoots our visitors and ultimately causes damage to this kind of gift that they were going to give us. And you know, you're always frustrated with the kind of like the warlike nature that humans will tend to have, and they have that kind of shoot first and ask questions later attitude. And if you are to think, you know, if there was ever a first contact, what would that really be what we would be like? Probably. Now this question is kind of asked in this movie, Cosmic Sin. Cosmic Sin refers to essentially genocide of an entire race on a preemptive strike. So what we have in this movie, it takes place 500 or so years in the future, and the humans have colonized space. They're on various kind of worlds at this point, and on one of these remote kind of worlds there is first contact with an alien race, but it seems to be aggressive, and technology now enables these kind of aliens to transport to Earth pretty quickly, and they seem to be able to infect humans with kind of like a parasitic entity which kind of takes over their system. So we have a skirmish on Earth, and then it is decided through a group of kind of military and scientists to do a first strike on this entire alien homeworld, where they can just essentially wipe out their entire kind of solar system in a preemptive strike to prevent them from kind of invading Earth. There's some ethical questions that are raised, but ultimately it's decided to kind of go ahead with this, and we get our team of soldiers, scientists and engineers try and find out where this kind of like this alien homeworld might be through going to try and, you know, trace their kind of radioactive signatures from this kind of first contact point, things like that. What'll happen? You'll have to watch the movie to find out. So, what can we say that works in this movie? Now, as I've mentioned, The Day That Earth Has Stood Still, it's a classic movie for a reason, and it brings forth that emotive feelings of, oh, you know, what would happen if the guy hadn't have shot him? And I think this movie thinks that it's trying to ask a similar question, but you know, it ultimately it doesn't. But I at least I think, okay, maybe this movie is trying to do something, have a little bit more thought to it, rather than just have a complete shoot 'em up. Even though ultimately I don't think it really succeeds in doing that, but nonetheless, I applaud the attempt. So there's that. The aesthetics of this movie are to a higher standard than some of the kind of the science fiction B movies that we've seen. I was actually reminded a little bit of kind of the Warhammer 40,000 style kind of aesthetic here, where we have soldiers both from the human side and the aliens in kind of like cool space looking armour, and then we have, you know, fist fights, we have shootouts with kind of futuristic weapons in this cool looking armour. So it has a cool kind of scientific aesthetic that I have to say I quite enjoyed. We've got quite a good cast here. I obviously mentioned some of the kind of more recognisable names, but I think there are some, you know, some other faces here that you'll recognise as well. And some do a better job than others. I think Frank Grillo, though he has relatively small screen time, you know, I always feel like he puts in kind of 100% in whatever film he's in, to be honest with you. He's always seems a pretty good, very kind of earnest kind of actor. And I think there are some of the other actors here do an alright job as well. And then there are some kind of fun science fiction kind of like battles, and kind of like the way these spacesuits that they have are able to kind of travel through space and kind of have like force fields. There's some sort of fun sort of science fiction, science fantasy kind of ideas here, and we have quite a fun character in when they go to this kind of one of these like colonized worlds that have humans on it. There's a fun female kind of character there who's like walking around with this like huge gun, and she's actually one of my probably the favourite character in the movie, although she doesn't turn up until halfway through. But yeah, she's kind of like a fun, no-nonsense kind of like soldier, which I quite enjoyed. So what doesn't work? as I've mentioned, I think on a thematic point, it asks questions, and it really asks you to think about the morality of what would happen in kind of a situation like this, and how it reflects to the human nature and stuff. But I don't really think it really expands upon it. It doesn't do anything meaningful with it. I think it just kind of like has it in there because it will create kind of a cool name for the movie, but ultimately it doesn't really explore any type of morality issues within that. It's kind of like it's mentioned in really one conversation, and then it's kind of never really addressed again, and we never really get a anything other than kind of like one point of view from that way. As in, yes, this is the way to go. You know, it is the right thing to do to try and like kill all these kind of like this entire species and stuff like that, without any kind of nuances to kind of to or from. Now, maybe this doesn't want to. Maybe the movie doesn't want to. It just wants to have ultimately kind of like that set up to have a kind of an action movie, and that's fair enough if that's what it wants to do. But ultimately, I was a little disappointed that it ends up being somewhat of a generic kind of alien shoot 'em up film. Bruce Willis in this movie, he is typical of, I would say, latter day Bruce Willis performances. His character never really seems to emote that much when he's kind of like, I mean, granted, he's meant to be this cool, collected kind of like soldier and stuff, but you know, I think they've written around Bruce Willis rather than kind of written a character that Bruce Willis embodies, if that makes sense. So, you know, he's there, he gives it some star power. But I wonder why he's choosing to do these kind of like lower budget movies. I mean, you know, there you go. But it ultimately ends up being somewhat of a generic action science fiction movie. I like some of the production design. I think the some of the kind of the props that they use are really fun. There are some kind of neat touches in regards to some of the kind of the futuristic tech. For example, that we have like a robot kind of like barman, which is quite fun, that has like a holographic face. But on the flip side, you know, we see people, bear in mind, this is going to be 500 years in the future, and yet we see people driving around in what looks like modern trucks, modern fashion, modern like 2020 kind of like haircuts. Someone's got a motorbike. You know, the kind of the language, it's not really ever kind of really thought about trying to make it genuinely feel like this is kind of 500 years in the kind of the future. It just seems like outside of a couple of kind of like robot barman and a kind of holographic display for a singer, you would be mistaken thinking this is just 2020 in the kind of like the Earth's kind of scenes. It doesn't really do much to say this is 500 years in the future, stuff like that. Even if it looks bizarre, I think it would have been nice to have some weird things kind of added to this to try and really make it seem like it was not just, you know, filmed within the last kind of year or so. And it's 500 years in the future. Think about how different it was 500 years in the past. This looks practically much the same. Ultimately, pretty much a generic action film. I wouldn't say it is necessarily bad. Certainly better than Bruce Willis's other science fiction movie, Breach, or aka Anti-Life, that I think came out a kind of a short time ago. And it is watchable and well made to a point of it being a serviceable kind of science fiction action movie. But it doesn't really have anything grandiose to say. I think the thematic and kind of physiological questions that it might ask are kind of just lost in the shuffle. They ask the questions, but then they kind of pretty much ignore it. I'll give it a 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to you next time. Bye for now.